Canada's population cracked over 40 million in June 2023 after welcoming more than 1 million newcomers into the country in just 12 months. This marks a 2.7% increase in annual growth rate, the highest we've seen since 1957, when Canada was in the middle of its post-war baby boom. In today's video, we're going to explore the impact of Canada's population growth on the housing market over the next 7 years. If this sounds interesting for you, hang in there for an in-depth analysis of Canada's housing market supply and demand, where together we will explore data from Stats Canada and the CMHC, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, where we'll look at the interaction of those two economic forces on Canada's housing affordability. So by the end of this video, you will learn about the foundational components of Canada's housing market and how things are going to look like over the next 7 years. Now, without further ado, let's jump right into the video. This is all good news because Canada is a huge country and obviously we need more people to come live here. And there's no doubt that the strength of the Canadian economy is measured in part by the number of people that are working within the labor force and paying taxes in order to fund all the public services that we get to enjoy, including education, healthcare, and the public roads, just to name a few. Our high-skilled and diverse immigration system is not only important to slow the growth in the age dependency ratio, but it's also a crucial component for our federal strategy to create a sustainable economy that fosters innovation in science, technology, medicine, creates new job opportunities in the workforce, and of course, bring families together. All right, we just started the video and there's already a few economic concepts that's worth unpacking and discovering together just to make sure we're all on the same page. All right, so the age dependency ratio is an important metric for Canada because it represents the number of people within the workforce that are able to support the dependent population. The dependent population represents anyone who's older than 65 years old or retiring, or anyone who's younger than 15 years old. And the lower the age dependency ratio, the better it is for our economy, because that means we have more funds in order to fund our public services, to pay for education, universities, public roads, healthcare, etc. Now, some of us might be wondering, and rightfully so, why would Canada want to bring in even more immigrants into the country, knowing that they're going to eventually age and become part of the dependent population? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Canada favors young working age people because they want them to be part of the economy, paying taxes and paying for our public services. And the more population we have, the more we are ready to prepare for a gradual, more manageable transition in order to support retirees in the long run. Now that we have a better understanding of the age dependency ratio and we know why Canada is incentivized to keep this metric low, let's put things into perspective and see where Canada stacks up against other G7 countries in this regard. So I pulled up this chart from ourworldindata.org, which is a public site that consolidates information from different government websites, where we can nicely visualize this information and, of course, other economic metrics. But for our sake, we're going to look at how Canada stacks up against Japan, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Germany, and the United States. The first thing that jumps right at me from this chart is the age dependency ratio in the year 2000. This is where Canada marked a rate of 46%, the lowest amongst all other G7 countries, and continued to do so all the way till the year 2021. Watch this. In 2007, the rate in Canada was at 43.8%, and in 2021, it jumped up to 52%. So what does this mean in terms of people and money? Well, in 2007, it costed Canada 2 working people to support 5 dependent people. And in 2021, it costed Canada 2 working people to support 4 dependent people. As you can see, this is a 20% jump in terms of cost. While this might look like Canada is doing a much better job than the other G7 countries at maintaining a low age dependency ratio, it's actually not enough for our country to support all the public services we offer to retirees. Well, for Canada to support the retirees coming up over the next 40 years, it needs to bring in 1.5 million immigrants annually. And this explains to me why Canada wants to bring in around 500,000 immigrants every year over the next 2 years by the year 2025. Now that we've unpacked the meaning behind the age dependency ratio and we have a better understanding of what that means for Canada's economic sustainability, let's take a dive into Canada's population growth and see how the numbers look like. So on this slide, we're looking at 4 charts, but we're just going to focus on 2 of them. It's going to be the top right chart named population growth and the bottom left chart named factors of population growth. And what's interesting here is to look at, the total number of individuals that came into the country quarter over quarter in 2022, summing up to 1.05 million, and contrasting this number with the factors of population growth chart in pink, 1.007 million. And the reason why this is interesting is because the 1.007 million represents net international migration. So those are all the immigrants that came to Canada under the permanent resident status, under the skilled worker status, under the international student status, and refugees. And look how big this number is. It represents 96% of the total population growth. This is how important immigration is for Canada's evolution, GDP growth, economic growth, and everything we need to keep this country moving forward. So far, we've spoken about the importance of immigration on Canada's economic sustainability. And while this might seem like our immigration policies are working and preparing us to offset Canada's aging population, there are several economic risks associated with our immigration approach that, if not accounted for properly, can severely impact our economic sectors wherever growth in demand is 2, 3, 4 times the growth in supply. Think about healthcare, transportation, and of course, Canada's housing market and our ability to build new housing at such a rapid pace. With more than 47% of net new immigrants and 42% of new permanent residents choosing to stay in Ontario in just last year, Ontario remains as the #1 most desired province all across Canada for immigrants. And one thing for sure is that these people want a place to call home. In the remaining segment of this video, we're going to focus our attention on the demand and the supply side of the housing market, where we're going to explore the growth in population for Ontario specifically and contrast that with the CMHC new housing completions for 2022. And then we're going to look at the new housing starts for 2023 and how the numbers look like for June this month. All right, remember how we mentioned early on in the video that 47% of Canada's net international migrants decided to live in Ontario in 2022? Well, let's go to Stats Canada's website to see how many individuals this number represents, because this will formulate the demand side of the equation, which from there on we're going to compare to the supply side of housing and see how well we did. So whether or not we have a shortage in housing or a surplus. And we're just going to use simple math to do this. It's literally, we're going to compare the demand side minus the supply side and see how much net negative we are or how much net positive we are in the market. So let's go into it. To start, I'm just going to open a browser and type in statcan.gc.ca. And then from there, navigate to the top right-hand corner where you see the search website. And then type in Canada Demographic Estimates. Few search results pop up. But what I'm interested in is the quarterly demographic estimates, because this has enough information for us to look at population growth and how many individuals came to Canada in 2022 and how they're going to impact the housing market. So from the search results, I'm just going to click on the latest release, which says September 2022. And believe me, it's got data up till Q1 2023. So don't be scared to click on that. I'm going to hit on data visualization. And ta-da, we've got a beautiful dashboard just consolidating and summarizing all the population information that we have around the country. And of course, feel free to play around with this dashboard. It's a little bit of fun. I'm just going to hit on last 5 years, all quarters, to filter on the last 5 years, obviously, and then navigate to the top left corner for provinces and territories so I can filter specifically on Ontario. So I'm going to unselect all and then select Ontario. And as you can see, like from those 4 charts, you can look at the population growth quarter over quarter. You can look at the factors of population growth and then the interprovincial migration components. But for the sake of our exercise, we're just going to look at the factors of population growth, where we can see clearly in Ontario, it peaked in Q3 2022 at 154,000 individuals that are, of course, net international migrants came to Ontario. And if we sum up all those net international migrants, the sum would come up to 474,000 net international migrants that came to live in Ontario. So the most valid question would be, where did these people live in Ontario? And is this why we're seeing a surge in rental prices? Now that we've identified the demand side of the housing market, let's head off to the CMHC to look at the supply side. So we're going to go to the CMHC website, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and look out for housing starts and completions. Once we look at the search results, we will see that there's a link to housing starts, completions, and units under construction. So I'm just going to click on that. And from there on, I'm going to navigate to the center of the page where you see a hyperlink for starts, completions, and under constructions by census subdivisions. So once you click on this, you'll get access to the housing market information portal. It's a hyperlink. It's also in the center of the page. Just going to click on that because it makes things much easier. Yes, the CMHC reported the construction of 60,329 units in Ontario in 2022, which accounts for providing housing to around 145,218 individuals across the different property types and after adjusting 4 persons per household. So what I've done here is I've summarized this information in a 5x3 matrix. We're looking at the top 5 metro areas in Ontario across with the 3 different property category types. So detached, semi-detached, plus townhomes is another, and then condo apartments is another third category. And then if we do the multiplication of PPH, which is the person per household, times the number of units built across each category, we can come up with the number of individuals each of those metro areas can support in terms of shelter. So in Toronto, we've built enough homes to support 65,864 individuals versus Hamilton, where we've built enough shelter to support 7,608 individuals. I guess what's interesting to call out from this information is the fact that Toronto is contributing to 3 times the second runner-up in terms of housing supply. And this is a tremendous effort for a city like Toronto to be leading the initiative with. The reason is because there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes that are unseen by us as the end consumer in terms of like what it takes to make those condo units or houses available for us to live in and enjoy life in Canada. And I feel like we got to be a little bit more grateful to all those hardworking people that are not only building the buildings themselves, but also thinking about making sure everything is planned out and seamless to their best of their abilities. Of course, nothing is perfect, but also recognizing that this is not easy feat. It's not something that you just plan out with your friends and you come up with. There's a lot of planning and regulation compliance that needs to be met, whether that's in terms of safety regulations, building permits, water supply permits, the electricity grid needs to be on par, and all the infrastructure that is in between needs to be all checked off in terms of making sure those housing units are habitable and compliant with Ontario's bylaw. So let's just take a moment here to say that we've built enough units to support 65,000 individuals in 2022, and of course there's much more room for growth. So if we compare this number to the projected housing supply by the CMHC from June 2022, we realize that we're actually a lot short on the housing supply. And we've only able to deliver on 67% of what was projected last year. So that tells me a few things here. First of all, that we were not able to deliver on the remaining 33% of housing, which, by the way, would explain why our housing prices keep rising and rent prices keep rising in 2023. And the second thing is that maybe there's a disconnect between the immigration policy group, the IRCC, and the CMHC. Those are 2 government agency groups that are supposed to be working together, but surprisingly, well, probably not surprisingly, it seems that they were working in silos and they're not aware of how much population growth is anticipated for the year 2022. And for some reason, the CMHC analysts and economists couldn't align with Immigration Canada on the projected number of population growth. So for me, that is puzzling and surprising at the same time. For those of us who are following closely and couldn't do the math to add up to 145,218 individuals, um, it's my bad. This slide here breaks down the total housing completion PPH adjusted across all the metro areas within Ontario. And you can clearly see how aggregately they sum up to 145,218 in the last column of this table. The 33% in housing shortage compared to the CMHC's projected housing supply from their June 2022 report tells us a lot. But let's unpack this 33% before we continue in this analysis. So I went back to the CMHC's report, which is titled Housing Shortages in Canada Solving the Affordability Crisis, which is basically a 40-plus page deck that talks about the different economic metrics they use to project and forecast income, housing supply, population growth, and whatnot, and how all these indicators impact housing affordability in Canada. And what we're going to focus on here is basically figure 5 projections to 2030, where we can look at Ontario's year-over-year growth in housing supply and come up with the number of 90,167 units, which if we use the same logic as we used previously for PPH adjustment, we can estimate how many people this housing stock can accommodate, and it totals up to 217,041 individuals. And then if we contrast this number with the actual housing completions that we saw from the CMHC, we are short technically 33% from what we were supposed to build in order to maintain the current housing affordability rates. Well, the CMHC report from June 2022 mentioned that Ontario home building needs to increase by at least 38% through 2030 in order to maintain the growth in immigration and to maintain the current housing affordability rates. Luckily, we have few other outlets aside from the CMHC to lean on to better understand the elements and the factors that drive Canada's housing affordability. And for this sake, we're just going to go back to RBC Economics' most recent release on housing affordability, where they look at the rate as of Q1 2023. And at least for Toronto, this is where we see a drop in housing affordability from the peak to 79%. Now that we've figured out the supply side of Ontario's housing market in 2022, let's go back to Stats Canada to see the population growth figures. It clearly shows here that in Ontario, we've added 445,000 individuals in just 2022. And now that we have those numbers at an individual level, it would be fair for us to just do a simple math to compare how much below or above the housing supply we are. And if we compare the housing demand actual, which is the 444,000, to the housing supply actual, which is the 145,000, we get a household housing deficit of 300,277 individuals. So this means that in Ontario in 2022, we were 3 times short on housing supply compared to our population growth. Yes, we are not building as fast. Now that we've backtested the supply and demand data that we have on Ontario's housing market in the year 2022, it has become more evident for us that Ontario's housing supply cannot just keep up with our population growth. And yes, we want more immigrants to come into the country to contribute to our economy's growth, whether that's skilled workers or trade workers or international students, because this would help out in spending within our economy. We need to figure out our plan when it comes to building permits and zoning bylaws and making sure that we have enough construction workers that are building at the speed upon which we need to provide housing. For those of us who are curious to learn about how things are shaping up in Canada in the year 2023, we're going to spend the remaining segment of this video looking at the housing starts, which is a leading indicator from the CMHC that tells us how many new construction projects are starting. To do this, I'm going to head out to tradingeconomics.com, which is a site that fetches information from the CMHC and then puts it in a nice visualization. And on this bar graph, we can clearly see that housing starts in Canada fell by 23% between April and May this year. And look how then it shot up by 41% to 281,000 units in just June. So this is a massive increase, and apparently it's the largest we've seen in the past 10 years. If we dive deeper into the CMHC data, we realize that the Toronto Census Metropolitan Area recorded a significant increase in housing starts in just 1 month between May and June 2023. And this increase amounted to 110% from 38,000 units to 81,000 units. And this is a massive increase compared to what we see for Montreal and Vancouver. So some of us might attribute this increase to the fact that the housing market saw a positive sentiment back in March and April when the Bank of Canada decided to pause the quantitative tightening. So the question right now would be, how is the market reacting to the fact that the Bank of Canada had already increased interest rates since that point in time, now that we stand at a bank rate of 5.25%? Is housing starts going to drop again to the levels that we saw in May 2023, or is it going to continue going up? I made this video to illustrate that while we might see affordability improve in some regions across Canada, low housing inventory combined with an influx of newcomers into the country will continue to put upward pressure on housing prices and potentially reverse the improvement in housing affordability. And if the central bank continues to push forward its quantitative tightening policies with interest rates hovering above the 5% mark, housing prices are only going to moderate price increases temporarily, just like what we saw in the months of June 2023, and then immediately get offset by the increase in demand. And we now have evidence to validate the CMHC's prediction on Canada's housing shortage. And in fact, they've come up with a much more optimistic outlook of Canada's housing crisis. The reason I say this is because the CMHC projected the household numbers to grow by over 2 million from 2021 levels to reach over 17.5 million individuals by the year 2030. And the assumption here is that we're going to continue to grow our population at our historical average rates, which is around 1.4% per year. However, if we contrast that with what's currently happening in Canada, we can clearly see that we are way off our average historical population growth rates. Currently, we are at around 3.08% in terms of population growth. And just in the past 12 months, we've added 1.2 million individuals to our population. All this to say that the CMHC report on housing shortage from June 2022 is no longer representative of what's currently happening in the Canadian housing market. And that housing affordability, especially in the metro areas of Canada, is just going to continue to rise and go through the roof. Prices today are going to be at 20 to 30% discount in 2030. To make sense out of all this, it would be helpful if we can look at the supply and the demand of the Canadian housing market side by side and see how this trend progressed over the years. So what I've done is I've plotted out the annual change in population versus the annual change in housing completions. And as you can see here, those two trends, the supply and the demand, kind of track each other up until the year 2016. And from there on, they diverge into completely different directions, where we can clearly see that the population growth rises at a much faster pace than the growth in housing completions. And this growth in population continues to persist up until the year 2022, and more so in 2023. So this is where the problem lies. This is where we have the gap between the population growth and our ability to build housing to accommodate this growth in population. I think this chart says it all, so let me know your thoughts on it.